Chapter 39 of the First Violin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The First Violin by Jessie Fothergill. Chapter 39. Where is my father? We had been bidden to dine at the Schloss, Frau Mittendorf, Stella and I. In due time the doctor's new carriage was called out, and seated in it we were driven to the great castle. With a renewed joy and awe I looked at it by twilight, with the dusk of sunset veiling its woods, and turning the whole mass to the colour of a deep earth-stain. Eugen's home! There he had been born as the child of such a race, and in its traditions he had been nurtured by that sad lady whom we were going to see. I at least knew that he had acted, and was now acting, up to the very standard of his high calling. The place has lost much of its awfulness for me; it had become even friendly and lovely. The dinner was necessarily a solemn one. I was looking out for Sigmund, who, however, did not put in an appearance. After dinner, when we were all assembled in a vast salon, which the numberless wax lights did but partially, and in the centre, illuminate, I determined to make an effort at release from this seclusion, and asked the Countess, who had motioned to me to a seat beside her, where Sigmund was. "He seemed a little languid, and not inclined to come downstairs," said she. "I expect he is in the music room. He generally finds his way there." "Oh, I wish you would allow me to go and see him." "Certainly, my child," said she, ringing, and presently a servant guided me to the door of the music rooms, and in answer to my knock I was bidden herein. I entered. The room was in shadow, but a deep glowing fire burned in a great cavernous stone fireplace, and shone upon huge brass and irons on either side of the hearth. In an easy chair sat Brunken, the old librarian, and his white hair and beard were also warmed into rosiness by the fire glow. At his feet lay Sigmund, who had apparently been listening to some story of his old friend. His hands were clasped about the old man's knee, his face upturned, his hair pushed back. Both turned as I came in, and Sigmund sprang up, but ere he had advanced 2 paces, paused and stood still, as if overcome with languor or weariness. "Sigmund, I have come to see you," said I, coming to the fire, and greeting the old man, who welcomed me hospitably. I took Sigmund's hand. It was hot and dry. I kissed him. Lips and cheeks were burning and glowing crimson. I swept the hair from his brow. That, too, was burning, and his temples throbbed. His eyes met mine with a strange, misty look. Saying nothing, I seated myself in a low chair near the fire, and drew him to me. He nestled up to me, and I felt that if Eugen could see us he would be almost satisfied. Sigmund did not say anything. He merely settled his head upon my breast, gave a deep sigh as if of relief, and, closing his eyes, said: "Now, Brunken, go on." "As I was saying, mein Liebling, I hope to prove all former theorists and writers upon the subject to have been wrong." "He's talking about a MacGregor," said Sigmund, still not opening his eyes. "A MacGregor? What may that be?" I inquired. "Yes, some people say it was a real full-blown organ," explained Sigmund in a thick, hesitating voice, "and some say it was nothing better than a bagpipe, or dear, how my head does ache! And there are people who say it was a kettle drum, nothing more nor less, and Brunken is going to show that not one of them knew anything about it." "I hope so, at least," said Brunken with a modest placidity. "Oh, indeed," said I, glancing a little timidly into the far recesses of the deep, ghostly room, where the firelight kept catching the sheen of metal, the yellow whiteness of ivory keys or pipes, or the polished case of some string instrument. Strange, grotesque shapes looked out in the uncertain flickering light. But was it not a strange and haunted chamber? Ever it seemed to me as if breaths of air blew through it, which came from all imaginable kinds of graves, and were the breaths of those departed ones who had handled the strange collection, and who wished to finger or blow into or beat the dumb unvibrating things once more. Did I say unvibrating? I was wrong then. The strings sometimes quivered to sounds that set them trembling, something like a whispered tone I have heard from the deep, upturned throats of the great brazen trumpets, something like a distant moan floating around the gilded organ pipes. In after days, when Friedhelm Helfen knew this room, he made a wonderful fantasia about it, in which all the dumb instruments woke up, or tried to wake up to life again. For the whole place impressed him, he told me, as nothing that he had ever known. Brunken went on in a dry, droning tone, giving theories of his own as to the nature of the Magrepha, and I, with my arms round Sigmund, half listening to the sleepy monotone of the good old visionary. But what spoke to me with a more potent voice was the soughing and wuthering of the sorrowful wind without, which verily moaned around the old walls, and sought out the old corners, and wailed and plained and sobbed in a way that was enough to break one's heart. By degrees a silence settled upon us. Brunken, having satisfactorily annihilated his enemies, ceased to speak. The fire burned lower. Sigmund's eyes were closed. His cheeks were not less flushed than before, nor his brow less hot, and a frown contracted it. I know not how long a time had passed, but I had no wish to rise. The door was opened, and some one came into the room. I looked up. It was the Gräfin. Brunken rose and stood to one side, bowing. I could not get up, but some movement of mine, perhaps, disturbed the heavy and feverish slumber of the child. He started wide awake, with a look of wild terror, and gazed down into the darkness, crying out, "Mein Vater, where art thou?" A strange, startled, frightened look crossed the face of the Countess when she heard the words. She did not speak, and I said some soothing words to Sigmund, but there could be no doubt that he was very ill. It was quite unlike his usual silent courage and reticence to wring his small hands and with ever increasing terror turn a deaf ear to my soothings, sobbing out in tones of pain and insistence, "Father, Father, where art thou? I want thee." Then he began to cry pitifully, and the only word that was heard was, "Father." It was like some recurrent wail in a piece of music, which warns one all through of a coming tragedy. "Oh dear, what is to be done? Sigmund, was ist denn mit dir, mein Engel?" said the poor Countess, greatly distressed. "He is ill," said I. "I think he has taken an illness. Does thy head ache, Sigmund?" "Yes," said he, "it does. Where is my own father? My head never ached when I was with my father." "Mein Gott, mein Gott!" said the Countess in a low tone. "I thought he had forgotten his father." "Forgotten!" echoed I. "Frau Gräfin, he is one of yourselves. You have not seemed to forget." "Herr Gott!" she exclaimed, wringing her hands. "What can be the matter with him? What must I say to Bruno? Sigmund, darling, what hast thou then? What ails thee?" "I want my father," he repeated, nor would he utter any other word. The one idea, long dormant, had now taken full possession of him. In fever, half delirious, out of the fullness of his heart, his mouth spake. "Sigmund, Liebchen," said the Countess, "control thyself. Thy uncle must not hear thee say that word." "I don't want my uncle. I want my father," said Sigmund, looking restlessly round. "Oh, where is he? I have not seen him. It is so long, and I want him. I love him. I do love my father. I want him." It was pitiful, pathetic, somewhat tragic too. The poor Countess had not the faintest idea what to do with the boy, whose illness frightened her. I suggested that he should be put to bed, and the doctor sent for, as he had probably taken some complaint which would declare itself in a few days, and might be merely some childish disorder. The Countess seized my suggestion eagerly. Sigmund was taken away. I saw him no more that night. Presently we left the Schloss and drove home. I found a letter waiting for me from Eugen. He was still at Elberthal, and appeared to have been reproaching himself for having accepted my sacrifice, as he called it. He spoke of Sigmund. There was more, too, in the letter, which made me both glad and sad. I felt life spreading before me, ending with a gravity, a largeness of aim, and a dignity of purpose such as I had never dreamt of before. It seemed that for me, too, there was work to do. I also had a love for whose sake to endure. This made me feel grave. Eugen's low spirits and the increased bitterness with which he spoke of things made me sad. But something else made me glad. Throughout his whole letter there breathed a passion, a warmth restrained, but glowing through its bond of reticent words, an eagerness which he told me that at last, as I loved, loved am I. Even after that sail down the river I had felt a half mistrust. Now all doubts were removed. He loved me. He had learned it in all its truth and breadth since we last parted. He talked of renunciation, but it was with an anguish so keen as to make me wince for him who felt it. If he renounced me now, it would not be the cold laying aside of a thing for which he did not care. It would be the wrenching himself away from his heart's desire. I triumphed in the knowledge, and this was what made me glad. Almost before we had finished breakfast in the morning, there came a thundering of wheels up to the door, and a shriek of excitement from Frau Middendorf, who, Morgenhaube on her head, a shapeless old morning gown clinging hideously about her ample figure, rushed to the window, looked out, and announced the carriage of the Frau Gräfin. "Aber what can she want at this early hour?" she speculated, coming into the room again, and staring at us both with wide open eyes, round with agitation and importance. "But I dare say she wishes to consult me upon some matter. I wish I were dressed more becomingly. I have heard, that is, I know, for I am so intimate with her, that she never wears negligee. I wonder if I should have time to—" She stopped to hold out her hand for the note which a servant was bringing in, but her face fell when the missive was presented to me. "Liebe May," it began, "will you come and help me in my trouble? Sigmund is very ill. Sometimes he is delirious. He calls for you often. It breaks my heart to find that after all not a word is uttered of us, but only of Eugen. Burn this when you have read it. Of you, and of Karl and Friedhelm, and one or two other names which I do not know. I fear this petition will sound troublesome to you. You were certainly not made for trouble, but you are kind. I saw it in your face. I grieve too much. Truly, the flesh is fearfully weak. I would live as if earth had no joys for me, as indeed it has none, and yet that does not prevent my suffering. May God help me, trusting to you. Your Hildegarde V. Rothenfels." I lost no time in complying with this summons. In a few moments I was in the carriage. Ere long I was at the Schloss, was met by Countess Hildegarde, looking like a ghost that had been keeping a strict Lent, and was at last by Sigmund's bedside. He was tossing feverishly from side to side, murmuring and muttering. But when he saw me he was still. A sweet, frank smile flitted over his face, a smile wonderfully like that which his father had lately bent upon me. He gave a little laugh, saying, "Fräulein May, welcome. Have you brought my father? And I should like to see Friedhelm too. You and dear father and Friedhelm used to sit near together at the concert. Don't you remember? I went once and you sung that whole Black Man Beat time, and My father never stopped looking at you and listening. Friedhelm, too. I will ask them if they remember." He laughed again at the reminiscence, and took my hand and asked me if I remembered, so that it was with difficulty that I steadied my voice and kept my eyes from running over as I answered him. Gräfin Hildegarde behind wrung her hands and turned to the window. He did not advance any reminiscence of what had happened since he came to the Schloss. There was no doubt that our Sigmund was very ill. A visitation of scarlet fever of the worst kind was raging in Lauenburg and in the hamlet of Rothenfels, which lay about the gates of the Schloss. Sigmund, some 10 days before, had ridden with his uncle, and waited on his pony for some time outside a row of cottages, while the Count visited one of his old servants, a man who had become an octogenarian in the service of his family, and upon whom Graf Bruno periodically showed the light of his countenance. It was scarcely to be doubted that the boy had taken the infection then and there, and the doctor did not conceal that he had the complaint in its worst form, and that his recovery admitted of the gravest doubts. A short time convinced me that I must not again leave the child till the illness was decided in one way or another. He was mine now, and I felt myself in the place of Eugen as I stood beside his bed and told him the hard truth that his father was not here, nor Friedhelm, nor Karl, for whom he also asked, but only I. The day passed on. A certain conviction was growing every hour stronger with me. An incident at last decided it. I had scarcely left Sigmund's side for 8 or 9 hours, but I had seen nothing of the Count, nor heard his voice, nor had any mention been made of him, and remembering how he adored the boy, I was surprised. At last Gräfin Hildegarde, after a brief absence, came into the room, and with a white face and parted lips, said to me in a half whisper: "Liebe Miss Wedderburn, will you do something for me? Will you speak to my husband?" "To your husband?" I ejaculated. She bowed. "He longs to see Sigmund, but he dare not come. For me, I have hardly dared to go near him since the little one began to be ill. He believes that Sigmund will die, and that he will be his murderer, having taken him out that day. I have often spoken to him about making their armor ride too far, and now the sight of me reminds him of it. He cannot endure to look at me. Heaven help me! Why was I ever born?" She turned away without tears. Tears were not in her line, and I went, much against my will, to find the Graf. He was in his study. Was that the same man, I wondered, whom I had seen the very day before, so strong and full of pride and life? He raised a haggard, white, and ghastly face to me, which had aged and fallen in unspeakably. He made an effort, and rose with politeness as I came in. "Mein Fräulein, you are loading us with obligations. It is unheard of." But no thanks were implied in the tone, only bitterness. He was angry that I should be in the place he dared not come to. If I had not been raised by one supreme fear above all smaller ones, I should have been afraid of this haggard, eager-looking old man, for he did look very old in his anguish. I could see the rage of jealousy with which he regarded me, and I am not naturally fond of encountering an old wolf who has starved. But I used my utmost effort to prevail upon him to visit his nephew, and at last succeeded. I piloted him to Sigmund's room, led him to the boy's bedside. The sick child's eyes were closed, but he presently opened them. The uncle was stooping over him, his rugged face all working with emotion, and his voice broken as he murmured, "Ach, mein Liebling, art thou then so ill?" With a kind of shuddering cry, the boy pushed him away with both hands, crying, "Go away! I want my father, I say. Where is he? Why do you not fetch him? You are a bad man, and you hate him." Then I was frightened. The Count recoiled. His face turned deathly white, livid, his fist clenched. He glared down upon the now unrecognizing young face, and stuttered forth something, paused, then said in a low, distinct voice, which shook me from head to foot: "So, better that he should die. The brood is worthy the nest it sprung from. Where is our blood, that he whines after that hound, that hound?" With which, and with a fell look round, he departed, leaving Sigmund oblivious of all that had passed, utterly indifferent and unconscious, and me shivering with fear at the outburst I had seen. But it seemed to me that my charge was worse. I left him for a few moments, and, seeking out the Countess, spoke my mind. "Frau Gräfin, Eugen must be sent for. I fear that Sigmund is going to die, and I dare not let him die without sending for his father." "I dare not," said the Countess. She had met her husband, and was flung unnerved upon a couch, her hand over her heart. "But I dare, and I must do it," said I, secretly wondering at myself. "I shall telegraph for him." "If my husband knew!" she breathed. "I cannot help it," said I. "Is the poor child to die among people who profess to love him, with the one wish ungratified which he has been repeating ever since he began to be ill? I do not understand such love. I call it horrible inhumanity." "For Eugen to enter this house again," said she in a whisper. "I would to God that there were any other head as noble under its roof," was my magniloquent and thoroughly earnest inspiration. "Well, gnädige Frau, will you arrange this matter, or shall I?" "I dare not," she moaned, half distractedly. "I dare not, but I will do nothing to prevent you. Use the whole household. They are at your command." I lost not an instant in writing out a telegram and dispatching, by a man on horseback, to Lahnburg. I summoned Eugen briefly. "Sigmund is ill. I am here. Come to us." I saw the man depart, and then I went and told the Countess what I had done. She turned, if possible, a shade paler, then said, "I'm not responsible for it." Then I left the poor pale lady to still her beating heart and kill her deadly apprehensions in the embroidery of the lily of the field and the modest violet. No change in the child's condition. A lethargy had fallen upon him. That awful stupor, with the dark, flushed cheek and heavy breath, was to me more ominous than the restlessness of fever. I sat down and calculated. My telegram might be in Eugen's hand in the course of an hour. When could he be here? Was it possible that he might arrive this night? I obtained the German equivalent for Bradshaw, and studied it till I thought I had made out that, supposing Eugen to receive the telegram in the shortest possible time, he might be here by 11:30 that night. It was now 5 in the afternoon. 6 hours and a half, and at the end of that time his non-arrival might tell me he could not be here before the morrow. I sat still, and now that the deed was done, gave myself up, with my usual enlightenment and discretion, to fears and apprehensions. The terrible look and tone of Graf von Rothenfels returned to my mind in full force. Clearly it was just the most dangerous thing in the world for Eugen to do, to put in an appearance at the present time. But another glance at Sigmund somewhat reassured me in wondering whether the girl had ever before been placed in such a bizarre situation as mine. Darkness overtook me. Sigmund moved restlessly and moaned, stretching out little hot hands, and saying, "Father." I caught those hands to my lips, and knew that I had done right. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of the First Violin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The First Violin by Jessie Fothergill. Chapter 40. Vindicated. It was a wild night. Driving clouds kept hiding and revealing the stormy looking moon. I was out of doors. I could not remain in the house. It had felt too small for me, but now nature felt too large. I dimly saw the huge pile of the Schloss defined against the grey light. Sometimes, when the moon unveiled herself, it started out clear and black and grim. I saw a light in a corner window. That was Sigmund's room, and another in a room below. That was the Graf's study, and there the terrible man sat. I heard the wind moan among the trees, heard the great dogs baying from the kennels. From an open window came rich, low, mellow sounds. Old Brunken was in the music-room, playing to himself upon the violoncello. That was a movement from the Grand Septuor, the second movement, which is, if one may use such an expression, painfully beautiful. I bethought myself of the woods which lay hidden from me, the vast avenues, the lonely tanks, the grotesque statues, and that terrible figure with its arms cast upward at the end of the long walk, and I shivered faintly. I was some short distance down the principal avenue, and dared not go any further. A sudden dread of the loneliness and the night voices came upon me, my heart beating thickly. I turned to go back to the house. I would try to comfort poor Countess Hildegarda in her watching and her fears. But there is a step near me. Some one comes up the avenue with foot that knows its windings and its turns and twists, its ups and downs. "Eugen!" I said tremulously. A sudden pause, a stop. Then he said with a kind of laugh, "Witchcraft, Navarei," and was going on. But now I knew his whereabouts, and coming up to him, touched his arm. "This, however, is reality," he exclaimed, enfolding me and kissing me as he hurried on. "May, how is he?" "Just the same," said I, clinging to him. "Oh, thank Heaven that you are come!" "I drove to the gate and sent the fellow away. But what art thou doing alone at the Ghost's Corner on a stormy night?" We were still walking fast toward the Schloss. My heart was beating fast, half with fear of what was impending, half with intensity of joy at hearing his voice again, and knowing what that last letter had told me. As we emerged upon the great terrace before the house, Eugen made one, the only one, momentary pause, pressed my arm, and bit his lips. I knew the meaning of it all. Then we passed quickly on. We met no one in the great stone hall, no one on the stairway or along the passages. Straight he held his way, and I with him. We entered the room. Eugen's eyes leapt swiftly to his child's face. I saw him pass his hand over his mouth. I withdrew my hand from his arm and stood aside, feeling a tremulous thankfulness that he was here, and that that restless plaining would at last be hushed in satisfaction. A delusion. The face over which my beloved bent did not brighten, nor the eyes recognize him. The child did not know the father for whom he had yearned out his little heart. He did not hear the half frantic words spoken by that father as he flung himself upon him, kissing him, beseeching him, conjuring him with every foolish word of fondness that he could think of, to speak, answer, look up once again. Then fear, terror overcame the man. For the first time I saw him look pale with apprehension. "Not this cup, not this," murmured he. "Gott im Himmel! Anything short of this. I will give him up, leave him, anything, only let him live." He had flung himself, unnerved, trembling upon the chair by the bedside, his face buried in his hands. I saw the sweat stand upon his brow. I could do nothing to help, nothing but wish despairingly that some blessed miracle would reverse the condition of the child and me, lay me low in death upon that bed, place him safe and sound in his father's arms. Is it not hard, you father of many children, to lose one of them? Do you not grudge death his prize? But this man had but one. The love between them was such a love, as one meets perhaps once in a lifetime. The child's life had been a mourning to him, the father's a burden ever since they had parted. I felt it strange that I should be trying to comfort him, and yet it was so. It was his brow that leaned on my shoulder, it was he who was faint with anguish, so that he could scarce see or speak, his hand that was cold and nerveless. It was I who said, "Do not despair, I hope still."
"If he is dying," said Eugen, "he shall die in my arms."
With which, as if the idea were a dreary kind of comfort, he started up, folded Sigmund in a shawl, and lifted him out of bed, enfolding him in his arms, and pillowing his head upon his breast. It was a terrible moment, yet as I clung to his arm, and with him looked into our darling's face, I felt that von Francius's words spoken long ago to my sister contained a deep truth. This joy, so like a sorrow would I have parted with it 1,000 times. No. Whether the motion and movement roused him, or whether that were the crisis of some change, I knew not. Sigmund's eyes opened. He bent them upon the face above him, and after a pause of reflection, said in a voice whose utter satisfaction passed anything I had ever heard, "My own father!" released a pair of little wasted arms from his covering, and clasped them round Eugen's neck, putting his face close to his, and kissing him as if no number of kisses could ever satisfy him. Upon this scene, as Eugen stood in the middle of the room, his head bent down, a smile upon his face which no ultimate griefs could for the moment quench, there entered the Countess. Her greeting after 6 years of absence, separation, belief in his dishonesty, was a strange one. She came quickly forward, laid her hand on his arm, and said,
"Eugen, it is dreadfully infectious. Don't kiss the child in that way, or you will take the fever and be laid up too."
He looked up, and at his look a shock passed across her face. With pallid cheeks and parted lips, she gazed at him speechless. His mind, too, seemed to bridge the gulf. It was in a strange tone that he answered.
"Ah, Hildegarde, what does it matter what becomes of me? Leave me this."
"No, not that, Eugen," said I, going up to him, and I suppose something in my eyes moved him, for he gave the child into my arms in silence. The Countess had stood looking at him. She strove for silence, sought tremulously after a coldness, but in vain.
"Eugen!"
She came nearer, and looked more closely at him.
"Herrgott, how you are altered! What a meeting! Can it be 6 years ago? And now oh!"
Her voice broke into a very wail.
"We loved you. Why did you deceive us?"
My heart stood still. Would he stand this test? It was the hardest he had had. Gräfin Hildegarde had been, was dear to him. That he was dear to her, intensely dear, that love for him was entwined about her very heartstrings, stood confessed now.
"Why did you deceive us?"
It sounded more like, "Tell us we may trust you. Make us happy again." One word from him, and the poor sad lady would have banished from her heart the long staying unwelcome guest, belief in his falseness, and closed it away from her for ever. He was spared the dreadful necessity of answering her. A timid summons from her maid at the door told her the Count wanted to speak to her, and she left us quickly. Sigmund did not die. He recovered and lives now. But with that I am not at present concerned. It was the afternoon following that never-to-be-forgotten night. I had left Eugen watching beside Sigmund, who was sleeping, his hand jealously holding 2 of his father's fingers. I intended to call at Frau Mittendorf's door to say that I could not yet return there, and when I came back, said Eugen he would have something to tell me. He was going to speak with his brother, to tell him that we should be married.
and to speak about Sigmund," he added decisively. "I will not risk such a thing as this again. If you had not been here, he might have died without my knowing it. I feel myself absolved from all obligation to let him remain. My child's happiness shall not be further sacrificed." With this understanding I left him. I went toward the Countess's room to speak to her and tell her of Sigmund before I went out. I heard voices ere I entered the room, and when I entered it I stood still, and a sickly apprehension clutched my very heart. There stood my evil genius, the Bösegeist of my lover's fate, Anna Sartorius, and the Count and the Countess were present, apparently waiting for her to begin to speak. "You are here," said the Gräfin to me. "I was just about to send for you. This lady says she knows you." "She does," said I, hesitatingly. Anna looked at me. There was gravity in her face, and the usual cynical smile in her eyes. "You are surprised to see me," said she. "You will be still more surprised to hear that I have journeyed all the way from Elberthal to Lahnburg on your account, and for your benefit." I did not believe her, and composing myself as well as I could, sat down. After all, what could she do to harm me? She could not rob me of Eugen's heart, and she had already done her worst against him and his fair name. Anna had a strong will. She exerted it. Graf Bruno was looking in some surprise at the unexpected guest. The Countess sat rigidly upright, with a puzzled look, as if at the sight of Anna she recalled some far past scene. Anna compelled their attention. She turned to me, saying, "Please remain here, Miss Wedderburn. What I have to say concerns you as much as anyone here. You wonder who I am, and what business I have to intrude myself upon you," she added to the others. "I confess," began the Countess, and Anna went on. "You, gnädige Frau, have spoken to me before, and I to you. I see you remember, or feel you ought to remember me. I will recall the occasion of our meeting to your mind. You once called at my father's house, he was a music teacher, to ask about lessons for some friend or protégé of yours. My father was engaged at the moment, and I invited you into my sitting room, and endeavored to begin a conversation with you. You were very distant and very proud, scarcely deigning to answer me. When my father came into the room, I left it, but I could not help laughing at your treatment of me. You little knew from your shut-up, cozy existence among the lofty ones of the earth what influence even such insignificant persons as I might have upon your lot. At the time I was the intimate friend of, and in close correspondence with, a person who afterward became one of your family. Her name was Vittoria Leopardi, and she married your brother-in-law, Graf Eugen." The plain-looking, plain-spoken woman had her way. She had the same power as that which shone in the glittering eye of the Ancient Mariner. Whether we liked or not, we gave her our attention. All were listening now, and we listened to the end. "Vittoria Leopardi was the Italian governess at General von Reader's note, that is all that is written. At one time she had several music lessons from my father. That was how I became acquainted with her. She was very beautiful, almost as beautiful as you, Miss Wedderburn. And I, dull and plain myself, have a keen appreciation of beauty, and of the gentleness which dares not always accompany it. When I first knew her, she was lonely and strange, and I tried to befriend her. I soon began to learn what a singular mixture of sordid worldliness and vacant weak-mindedness dwelt behind her fair face. She wrote to me often, for she was one of those persons who must have some one to whom to relate their triumphs and conquests, and I suppose I was the only person she could get to listen to her. At that time, the time you called at our house, gnädige Frau, her epistles were decidedly tedious. What sense she had, there was never too much of it, was completely eclipsed. At last came the announcement that her noble and gallant Orlan had proposed, and been accepted naturally. She told me what he was, and his possessions and prospects. His chief merit in her eyes appeared to be that he would let her do anything she liked, and release her from the drudgery of teaching, for which she never had the least affinity. She hated children. She never hinted on any occasion that she loved him very much. In due time, the marriage, as you all know, came off. She almost dropped me then, but never completely so. I suppose she had that instinct which stupid people often have, as to the sort of people who may be of use to them some time. I received no invitations to her house. She used awkwardly to apologize for the negligence sometimes, and say she was so busy, and it would be no compliment to me to ask me to meet all those stupid people of whom the house was always full. That did not trouble me much, though I loved her none the better for it. She had become more a study to me now than anything I really cared for. Occasionally I used to go and see her, in the morning before she had left her room, and once only, I met her husband in the corridor. He was hastening away to his duty, and scarcely saw me as he hurried past. Of course, I knew him by sight as well as possible. Who did not? Occasionally she came to me to recount her triumphs and make me jealous. She did not wish to reign supreme in her husband's heart. She wished idle men to pay her compliments. Everybody knew the extravagance of that household, and the reckless neck-or-nothing habits of its master. People were indignant with him that he did not reform. I say it would have been easier for him to find his way alone up the Matterhorn in the dark than to reform after his marriage. There had been hope for him before. There was none afterward. A pretty inducement to reform she offered him. I knew that woman through and through, and I tell you that there never lived a more selfish, feeble, vain, and miserable thing. Always self, self, self. When she was mated to a man who never did think of self, whose one joy was to be giving, whose generosity was no less a byword than his recklessness, who was delighted if she expressed a wish, and would move heaven and earth to gratify it, the more eagerly, the more unreasonable it was. Mes amis, I think it is easy to guess the end. The end was ruin. I watched it come on, and I thought of you, Frau Gräfin. Vittoria was expecting her confinement in the course of a few months. I never heard her express a hope as to the coming child, never a word of joy, never a thought as to the wider cares which a short time would bring to her. She did say often, with a sigh, that women with young children were so tied they could not do this, and they could not do that. She was in great excitement when she was invited to come here, in great triumph when she returned. Eugen, she said, was a fool not to conciliate his brother, and that doting old saint, her words, gnädige Frau, not mine, more than he did. It was evident that they would do anything for him if he only flattered them, but he was so insanely downright. She called it stupid, she said. The idea of missing such advantages, when a few words of common politeness would have secured them. I may add that what she called common politeness was just the same thing as I called smooth hypocrisy. Very shortly after this, her child was born. I did not see her then. Her husband lost all his money on a race, and came to smash, as you English say. She wrote to me. She was in absolute need of money, she said. Eugen had not been able to give her any. He had said they must retrench. Retrench? Was that what she married him for? There was a set of turquoises that she must have, or another woman would get them, and then she would die. And her milliner, a most unreasonable woman, had sent word that she must be paid. So she was grumbling in a letter which I received one afternoon, and the next I was frightfully startled to see herself. She came in and said smilingly that she was going to ask a favor of me. Would I take her cab on to the bank and get a check cashed for her? She did not want to go there herself, and then she explained how her brother-in-law had given her a check for 1,000 thalers. Was it not kind of him? It really did not enter my head at the moment to think there was anything wrong about the check. She had endorsed it, and I took it, received the money for it, and brought it to her. She trembled so as she took it, and was so remarkably quiet about it, that it suddenly flashed upon my mind that there must be something not as it ought to be about it. I asked her a question or two, and she said, deliberately contradicting herself, that the Herr Graf had not given it to her, but to her husband. And then she went away, and I was sure I should hear more about it. I did. She wrote to me in the course of a few days, saying she wished she were dead, since Eugen by his wickedness had destroyed every chance of her happiness. She might as well be a widow. She sent me a package of letters, my letters, and asked me to keep them, together with some other things, an old desk among the rest. She had no means of destroying them all, and she did not choose to carry them to Rothenfels, whither she was going to be buried alive with those awful people. I accepted the charge. For 6 years, the desk, the papers, everything lay with some other possessions of mine, which I could not carry about with me, on the wandering life I led after my father's death, stored in an old trunk in the lumber room of a cousin's house. I visited that house last week. Certain circumstances which have occurred of late years induced me to look over those papers. I burned the old bundle of letters from myself to her, and then I looked through the desk. In a pigeonhole I found these. She handed some pieces of paper to Graf Bruno, who looked at them. I, too, have seen them since. They bore the imitations of different signatures: her husband's, Graf Bruno's, that of Anna Sartorius, and others which I did not know. The same conviction as that which had struck Anna flashed into the eyes of Graf von Rothenfels. "I found those," repeated Anna, "and I knew in a second who was the culprit. He, your brother, is no criminal. She forged the signature of the Herr Graf." "Who forged the signature of the Herr Graf?" asked a voice which caused me to start up, which brought all our eyes from Anna's face, upon which they had been fastened, and showed us Eugen standing in the doorway, with compressed lips and eyes that looked from one to the other of us anxiously. "Your wife," said Anna calmly, and before any one could speak she went on. "I helped to circulate the lie about you, Herr Graf." She spoke to Eugen. "For I disliked you. I disliked your family, and I disliked, or rather wished, to punish Miss Wedderburn for her behavior to me. But I firmly believed the story I circulated. The moment I knew the truth, I determined to set you right. Perhaps I was pleased to be able to circumvent your plans. I considered that if I told the truth to Friedhelm Helfen, he would be as silent as yourself, because you chose to be silent. The same with May Wedderburn. Therefore I decided to come to headquarters at once. It is useless for you to try to appear guilty any longer," she added mockingly. "You can tell them all the rest, and I will wish you good afternoon." She was gone. From that day to this I have never seen her nor heard of her again. Probably with her power over us, her interest in us ceased. Meanwhile I had released myself from the spell which held me, and gone to the countess. Something very like fear held me from approaching Eugen. Count Bruno had gone to his brother and touched his shoulder. Eugen looked up. Their eyes met.
It just flashed into my mind that after 6 years of separation the first words must be, words of reconciliation, of forgiveness asked on the one side, eagerly extended on the other.
Eugen,
In a trembling voice, and then with a positive sob.
canst thou forgive? My brother, I have not resented. I cannot. Honor in thee as honor in me. But that thou wert doubted, hated, mistaken.
But another had asserted herself. The Countess had come to herself again, and going up to him, looked him full in the face, and kissed him.
Now I can die happy. What folly, Eugen! And what folly like none but thine! I might have known.
A faint smile crossed his lips. For all the triumphant vindication, he looked very pallid.
I have often wondered, Hildegarde, how so proud a woman as you could so soon accept the worthlessness of a pupil on whom she had spent such pains as you upon me. I learned my best notions of honor and chivalry from you. You might have credited me rather with trying to carry the lesson out than with plucking it away and casting it from me at the first opportunity. You have much to forgive, said she. Eugen, you came to see me on business, said his brother.
Eugen turned to me. I turned hot and then cold. This was a terrible ordeal indeed. He seemed metamorphosed into an exceedingly grand personage as he came to me, took my hand, and said very proudly and very gravely,
"The first part of my business related to Sigmund. It will not need to be discussed now. The rest was to tell you that this young lady, in spite of having heard all that could be said against me, was still not afraid to assert her intention to honor me by becoming my wife and sharing my fate, now that she has learned the truth. May, do you still care for me enough to marry me? If so," interrupted his brother before I could speak, "let me add my petition and that of my wife. Do you allow me, Hildegarde?" "Indeed, yes, yes." "That she will honor us and make us happy by entering our family, which can only gain by the acquisition of such beauty and excellence."
The idea of being entreated by Graf Bruno to marry his brother almost overpowered me. I looked at Eugen, and stammered out something inaudible, confessed, too, by the look he gave me. He was changed. He was more formidable now than before, and he led me silently up to his brother without a word. Upon which Count Bruno crowned my confession by uttering some more very grandiose words, and saluting my cheek. That was certainly a terrible moment, but from that day to this I have loved better and better my haughty brother-in-law. Half in consideration for me, I believe the Countess began.
"But I want to know, Eugen, about this. I don't quite understand yet how you managed to shift the blame upon yourself."
"Perhaps he does not want to tell," said I hastily.
"Yes, since the truth is known, I may tell the rest," said he. "It was a very simple matter. After all was lost, my only ray of comfort was that I could pay my debts by selling everything and throwing up my commission. But when I thought of my wife, I felt a devil. I suppose that is the feeling which the devils do experience in place of love. At least Heine says so. Die Teufel nennen es Höllenqual, die Menschen nennen es Liebe. I kept it from her as long as I could. It was a week after Sigmund was born that at last one day I had to tell her. I actually looked to her for advice, help. It was tolerably presumptuous in me, I must say, after what I had brought her to. She brought me to reason. May Heaven preserve men from needing such lessons. She reproached me. Aye, she did reproach me. I thank my good genius, or whatever it is that looks after us, that I could set my teeth and not answer her a syllable. The minx, said the countess aside to me. I would have shaken her. What was she to do without a groschen? She concluded, and I could only say that I had had thoughts of dropping my military career and taking to music in good earnest. I had never been able to neglect it, even in any worse time, for it was a passion with me. She said, "A composed beggar!" That was hard. I asked her, "Will you not help me?" "Never to degrade myself in that manner," she assured me. Considering that I had deserved my punishment, I left her. I sat up all night, I remember, thinking over what I had brought her to, and wondering what I could do for her. I wondered if you, Bruno, would help her and let me go away and work out my punishment, for believe me, I never thought of shirking it. I had been most effectually brought to reason, and your example and yours, Hildegarde, had taught me a different kind of moral fiber to that. I brought your note about the check to Vittoria, and asked her if she knew anything about it. She looked at me, and in that instant I knew the truth. She did not once attempt to deny it. I do not know what, in my horrible despair and shame, I may have said or done. I was brought to my senses by seeing her cowering before me, with her hands before her face, and begging me not to kill her. I felt what a brute I must have been, but that kind of brutality has been knocked out of me long ago. I raised her and asked her to forgive me, and bade her keep silence and see no one, and I would see that she did not suffer for it. Everything seemed to stand clearly before me. If I had kept straight, the poor ignorant thing would never have been tempted to such a thing. I settled my whole course in half an hour, and have never departed from it since. I wrote that letter to you, and went to read it to my wife. I told her that I could never forgive myself for having caused her such unhappiness, and that I was going to release her from me. I only dropped a vague hint about the boy at first. I was stooping over his crib to say good-bye to him. She said, "What am I to do with him?" I caught at the idea, and she easily let me take him. I asked Hugo von Meilingen to settle affairs for me, and left that night. Thanks to you, Bruno, the story never got abroad. The rest you know. What did you tell Hugo von Meilingen? Only that I had made a mess of everything and broken my wife's heart, which he did not seem to believe. He was staunch. He settled up everything. Some day I will thank him for it. For 2 years I traveled about a good deal. Sigmund has been more a citizen of the world than he knows. I had so much facility of execution.
So much genius, you mean? I interposed.
That I never had any difficulty in getting an engagement. I saw a wonderful amount of life of a certain kind, and learned most thoroughly to despise my own past, and to entertain a thorough contempt for those who are still leading such lives. I have learned German history in my banishment. I have lived without true heroes, the lower middle classes. Well, you were always a radical, Eugen," said the Count indulgently. "At last, at Cologne, I obtained the situation of first violinist in the Elberthal Kapelle, and I went over there one wet October afternoon and saw the director, von Francius. He was busy, and referred me to the man who was next below me, Friedhelm Helfen." Eugen paused, and choked down some little emotion, ere he added, "You must know him. I trust to have his friendship till death separates us. He is a nobleman of nature's most careful making, a night sans peur et sans reproche. When Sigmund came here, it was he who saved me from doing something desperate or driveling. There is not much of a step between the two. Fräulein Sartorius, who seems to have a particular disposition, took it into her head to confront me with the charge of my guilt at a public place. Friedel never wavered, despite my shame and my inability to deny the charge. Oh dear, how beautiful!" said the countess in tears. "We must have him over here and see a great deal of him." "We must certainly know him, and that soon," said Count Bruno. At this juncture I, from mingled motives, stole from the room, and found my way to Sigmund's bedside, where also joy awaited me. The stupor and the restlessness had alike vanished. He was in a deep sleep. I knelt down by the bed and remained there long. Nothing, then, was to be as I had planned it. There would be no poverty, no shame to contend against, or struggle to make, except the struggle up to the standard so fearfully severe and unapproachable set up by my own husband, set up and acted upon by him. How could I ever attain it, or anything near it? Should I not be shocking him by coarse, gross notions as to the needlessness of this or that fine point of conduct? By my ill-defined ideas as to a code of honor, my slovenly ways of looking at questions? It was such a fearful height, this to which he had carried his notions and behavior in the matter of chivalry and loyalty. How was I ever to help him to carry it out? And moreover, to bring up this child before me, and perhaps children of my own, in the same rules. It was no doubt a much more brilliant destiny which actually awaited me than any which I had anticipated. The wife of a nobleman, with the traditions of a long line of noblemen and noble women to support, and a husband with the most impossible ideas upon the subject. I felt afraid. I thought of that poor, vain, selfish first wife, and I wondered if ever the time might come when I might fall in his eyes as she had fallen. For scrupulous though he was to cast no reproach upon her, I felt keenly that he despised her, that had she lived after that dreadful discovery he would never have loved her again. It was awful to think of. True, I should never commit forgery, but I might, without knowing it, fail in some other way, and then woe is me! Thus dismally cogitating, I was roused by a touch on my shoulder and a kiss on the top of my head. Eugen was leaning over me, laughing. "You have been saying your prayers so long that I was sure you must be asking too much." I confided some of my doubts and fears to him, for with his actual presence that dreadful height of morality seemed to dwindle down. He was human too, quick, impulsive, a very mortal. And he said, "I would ask thee one thing, May. Thou dost not seem to see what makes all the difference. I loved Vittoria. I longed to make some sacrifice for her. Would she but have let me, but she could not, poor girl. She did not love me." "Well?" "Well, mein Engel, you do," said he, laughing. "Oh, I see," said I, feeling myself blushing violently. Yes, it was true. Our union should be different from that former one. After all, it was pleasant to find that the high tragedy, which we had so wisely planned for ourselves, had made a faux pas and come ignominiously to ground. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of the First Violin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The First Violin by Jessie Fothergill. Chapter 41. And surely when all this is past, they will not want their rest at last. On the 23rd of December, I will not say how few or how many years after those doings, and that violent agitation which my friend Gräfin May
has striven to make coherent in the last chapter. I, with my greatcoat on my arm, stood waiting for the train which was to bear me 10 miles away from the sleepy old musical ducal Hauptstadt, in which I am herzoglicher Kapellmeister, to Rothenfels, where I was bidden to spend Christmas. I had not long to wait. Having ascertained that my bag was safe, in which reposed divers humble proofs of my affections for the friends of the past, I looked leisurely out as the train came in for a second-class carriage, and very soon found what I wanted. I shook hands with an acquaintance, and leaned out of the window, talking to him till the train started. Then, for the first time, I began to look at my fellow traveler. A lady, and most distinctly not one of my own countrywomen, who, whatever else they may excel in, emphatically do not know how to clothe themselves for traveling. Her veil was down, but her face was turned toward me, and I thought I knew something of the grand sweep of the splendid shoulders and the majestic bearing of the stately form. She soon raised her veil, and looking at me, said with a grave bow: "Herr Helfen, how do you do?" "Ah, pardon me, gnädige Frau. For the moment I did not recognize you. I hope you are well." "Quite well, thank you," said she with grave courtesy, but I saw that her beautiful face was thin and worn, her pallor greater than ever. She had never been a person much given to mirthfulness, but now she looked as if all smiles had passed forever from her lips. A certain secret sat upon them and closed them in an outline, sweet but utterly impenetrable. "You are going to Rothenfels, I presume?" she said. "Yes, and you also?" "I also, somewhat against my will, but I did not want to hurt my sister's feelings. It is the first time I have left home since my husband's death." I bowed. Her face did not alter. Calm, sad, and staid, whatever storms had once shaken that proud heart, they were lulled forever now. 2 years ago Adelaide von Francius had buried keen grief and sharp anguish, together with vivid hope or great joy, with her noble husband, whom we had mourned bitterly then, whom we yet mourn in our hearts, and whom we shall continue to mourn as long as we live. May's passionate conviction that he and she should meet again had been fulfilled. They had met, and each had found the other unchanged. And Adelaide had begun to yield to the conviction that her sister's love was love pure and simple, and not pity. Since his death she had continued to live in the town in which their married life had been passed, a life which for her was just beginning to be happy. That is to say, she was just learning to allow herself to be happy, in the firm assurance of his unutterable love and devotion, when the summons came. A sharp attack, a short illness, all over, eyes closed, lips too, silent before her for evermore. It has often been my fate to hear criticisms both on von Francius and his wife, and upon their conduct. This I know, that she never forgave herself the step she had taken in her despair. Her pride never recovered from the burden laid upon it, that she had taken the initiative, had followed the man whom had said farewell to her. Bad her lot was to be, sad and joyless, whether in its gilded cage or linked with the man whom she loved, but to be with whom she had had to pay such a terrible price. I have never heard her complain of life in the world. Yet she can find neither very sweet, for she is an extremely proud woman, who has made 2 terrible failures in her affairs. Von Francius, before he died, made a mark not to be erased in the hearts of his musical compatriots, had he lived. But that is vain. Still, one feels that one can now but feel that, as his widow said to me with matter-of-fact composure, "He was much more hardly to be spared than such a person as I, Herr Helfen. If I might have died and left him to enrich and gladden the world, I should have felt that I had not made such a mess of everything after all." Yet she never referred to him as "my poor husband," or by any of those softening terms by which some people approach the name of a dead dear one. All the same, we knew quite well that with him life had died for her. Since his death she and I had been in frequent communication. She was editing a new edition for his works, for which, after his death, there had been an instant call. It had lately been completed, and the music of our former friend shall, if I mistake not, become, in the best and highest sense of the word, popular music, the people's music. I had been her eager, and she was pleased to say, able assistant in this work. We journeyed on through the winter country, and I glanced at her now and then, at the still pale face which rose above her English-fashioned sealskin, and wondered how it was that some faces, though never so young and beautiful, have written upon them in unmistakable characters the end which one saw upon her face. Still, we talked about all kinds of matters, musical, private, and public. I asked if she went out at all. "Only to concerts with the von Francises, who have been friends of mine ever since I went to live near them," she replied, and the train rolled into the station of Lahnburg. There was a group of faces I knew waiting to meet us. "Ah, there is my sister Stella," said Adelaide, in a low voice. "How she is altered! And that is May's husband, I suppose. I remember his face now that I see it." We were caught sight of. 4 people came crowding round us. Eugen, my eyes fell upon him instantly. We grasped hands silently. His wife, looking lovelier than ever in her winter furs and feathers. A tall boy in a silkskin cap, my Sigmund, who had been hanging on his father's arm, and whose eyes welcomed me more volubly than his tongue, which was never given to excessive wagging. May and Frau von Francius went home in a carriage, which Sigmund, under the direction of an awful-looking Küche, drove. Stella, Eugen, and I walked to Rothenfels, and they quarreled, as they always did, while I listened and gave an encouraging word to each in turn. Stella Wedderburn was very beautiful, and after spending a Christmas at Rothenfels, she was going home to be married. Eugen, May, and Sigmund were going too, for the first time since May's marriage. Graf Bruno that year had temporarily abdicated his throne, and Eugen had been constituted host for the season. The guests were his and his wife's. The arrangements were his, and the entertainment fell to his share. Gräfin Hildegarde looked a little amazed at such of her guests. For instance, as Karl Linders. She had got over the first shock of her seeing me, a regular visitor, in the house, and was pleased to draw me aside on this occasion and inform me that really that young man, Herr Linders, was presentable, quite presentable, and never forgot himself. He had handed her into her carriage yesterday, really quite credibly. No doubt it was long friendship with Eugen which had given him that extra polish. Indeed, Frau Gräfin, he was always like that. It is natural. He is very presentable, really very, but as a friend of Eugen's, and she smiled condescendingly upon me, he would naturally be so. In truth, Karl was Karl. Time had not thinned his flowing locks. He was as handsome, as impulsive, and as true as ever. Had added 2 babies to his responsibilities, who, with his beloved Frau Gemahlin, had likewise been bidden to this festivity, but had declined to quit the stove and private Christmas tree of home life. He wore no more short jackets now. His sister Gretchen was engaged to a young doctor, and Karl's head was growing higher, as it deserved, for it had no mean or shady deeds to bow it. The company then consisted in total of Graf and Gräfin von Rothenfels, who, I must record it, both looked full 10 years younger and better since their prodigal was returned to them, of Stella Wedderburn, Frau von Francius, Karl Linders, and Friedhelm Helfen. May, as I said, looked lovelier than ever. It was easy to see that she was the darling of the elder brother and his wife. She was a radiant, bright creature, yet her deepest affections were given to sad people, to her husband, to her sister Adelaide, to Countess Hildegarde. She and Eugen are well matched. It is true he is not a very cheerful man. His face is melancholy. In his eyes there is a shadow which never wholly disappears, lines upon his broad and tranquil brow which are indelible. He has honor and titles, and a name clean and high before men, but it was not always so. That terrible bringing to reason, that 6 years' grinding lesson of suffering, self-suppression, aye, self-effacement, have left their marks, a shadow plain to see, and will never leave him. He is a different man from the outcast who stepped forth into the night with a weight upon him, nor ever looked back till it was dried out in darkness to its utmost term. He has tasted of the sorrows, the self-brought sorrows, which make merry men into sober ones, the sorrows which test a man and prove his character to be of gold or of dross. Grave, too, is the son, who is more worshipped by both him and his wife than any of their other children. Sigmund von Rothenfels is what outsiders call a strange, incomprehensible child. Seldom smiles, and has no child friends. His friends are his father and his mother May, Mütchen, he calls her, and it is quaint sometimes to see how on an equality the three meet and associate. His notions of what is fit for a man to be and do he takes from his father. His ideal woman, I am sure he has one, would, I believe, turn out to be a subtle and impossible compound of May and his Aunt Hildegarde. We sometimes speculate as to what he will turn out. Perhaps the musical genius, which his father will not bring before the world in himself, may one day astonish that world in Sigmund. It is certain that his very life seems bound up in the art, and in that house and that circle it must be a very Caliban, or something yet lower, which could resist the influence. One day May, Eugen, Karl, and I repaired to the music room and played together the Fourth Symphony and some of Schumann's Kinderschienen. But May began to cry before it was over, and the rest of us had thoughts that did lie too deep for tears, thoughts of that far back afternoon of Carnival Monday, and how we made a sunshine in a shady place, of all that came before and after. Between me and Eugen there has never come a cloud, nor the faintest shadow of one. Built upon days passed together in storm and sunshine, weal and woe, good report and evil report, our union stands upon a firm foundation of that nether rock of friendship, perfect trust, perfect faith, love stronger than death, which makes a peace in our hearts, a mighty influence in our lives, which very truly passeth understanding. The End. End of the first violin by Jessie Fothergill.